Hello, parishioners. Father Mark here. It's day 96 of the Bible in a Year, and we are beginning a new book, the first book of Samuel. And we're going to meet this great prophet Samuel, who, yes, was a prophet, but he's also the kingmaker, kingpin. He's the king. He's going to anoint some kings. We're going to move from theocracy, which was the preferred method, having God be the king, to it's problematic, and even Samuel was kind of against it, and God was against it, but finally people were insisting, and so they didn't trust God enough to have God be their king, so God allowed it, and so first Samuel's going to anoint, we're going to see he anoints Saul, and he doesn't turn out to be a very good king, but then he anoints David as the king, who's better because he's a man after God's own heart, but he's not perfect either. So there are the risks and rewards of kingship, which we're going to see. But of course, eventually it was God writing straight with crooked lines, because eventually Jesus Christ is a son of David. He's from the family of David, and he's the perfect king. And so that's how the Bible goes, where it was kind of eventually this dynasty rises up, and we're just going to see it here, the beginning of that in these first two chapters, when Samuel is born, and he's born of this woman Hannah, who's sterile and barren, but she prays and prays, and she's rewarded. But then she keeps her promise that she turns the baby over to the temple, to this temple service, which is amazing, and she is lent to the Lord, as it says, given to the Lord, and then she praises God with a prayer in chapter 2, which is very similar to the prayer of the Blessed Virgin Mary, that God, is faithful, and he's going to raise up a king, and that he casts down the lowly and raises up casts down the mighty and raises up the lowly. So these are some of the themes we're seeing. One of the themes is that Samuel is kind of like a new Moses, they say. There's a bunch of kind of parallels between the life of Moses and the life of Samuel. So Samuel is like a prophet like Moses, because the Lord said, "I will raise up a prophet like you." So Samuel is a preliminary. Jesus is the great prophet like Moses, the prophet, truly, the new Moses. But Samuel was kind of a new Moses too, in a certain way. Moses and Samuel, they were born of mothers who had to, give up their children and let them be raised by others. Both Moses and Samuel were kind of like prophet, priest, and judge or king, and they both interceded for the people, for the Israel. They both had two sons. They both wrote a book with laws. They both anointed others for sacred office. They both delivered farewell speeches at the end of their careers. And so those kind of things we'll see. And then again, that beautiful canticle that Hannah prays, it's like Mary's Magnificat. And it has some of the major themes of the book of Samuel, which are precisely that God casts down the mighty, and he raises up the lowly, kind of reversal of fortunes. That's how God is. God is always humbling the mighty and raising up the lowly. And this pattern is worked out in several ways. My study Bible says here that there's several ways. One of them is, for example, just that fact that Hannah was one of two wives of this man Elkanah, and the one had children and Hannah didn't have any, but then sure enough the one disappears from the story, and Hannah eventually is blessed with a nice family and becomes very famous. So she is lifted up. Another example is the fact that in the book of Samuel we see this high priest, this head priest Eli, who turns out to be not such a good priest because he doesn't discipline his two wicked sons, and so he is brought down. And in fact, his family line is cursed, and they're not going to be able to be the high priests anymore. And another family of the tribe of Aaron and Levi is going to take over later. But so that's another example. Another example is just the fact that Saul, King Saul, the first king, was kind of an impressive person, but then he is unfaithful and disobedient, really, and so he is replaced by David. So these are kind of things that we see, and the books of Samuel begin with this poem that Hannah prays, this song, Hannah's song. And the second book of Samuel, they say that the two books were sort of really used to be just one book. At the end of 2 Samuel, there's another long prayer. It's called David's Song. So that's kind of a frame that begins and ends with those two songs of praise to God, which are very similar to Mary's Magnificat in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1. In the second part of chapter 2, it speaks of these two wicked sons of Eli. They were priests in the temple, but they were taking advantage of, the nuns, really. They were women who were serving in the tabernacle or tent temple at Shiloh there. And that was a customary thing. As it says in verse 22, that these two sons used to lay with the women who served at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And my study Bible it's very interesting to me that there's evidence that there were actually kind of like consecrated virgins or women who would serve, female ministers in the sanctuary of Israel. And they would take care of things like baking the showbread and preparing incense and those kind of things. And there's extra biblical evidence to that. There's not a lot of evidence right in the Bible, but the Proto-Evangelium of St. James and the Mishnah, Hebrew Jewish writings indicate that there were these. But Eli, the priest, it's kind of like, it's almost as if, like some scandalous thing like priests and nuns, having liaisons, that kind of thing is, and it's like they're acting like the Canaanites, because in the pagan religion of the Canaanites, they would have cult prostitutes in their pagan temples. They would have prostitutes, and they had this kind of ritual prostitution, which was kind of supposed to be a fertility thing, supposedly to bring rain on the fields and things. They had these strange beliefs. So they were kind of, rationalizing maybe this kind of behavior. And so because these two sons of Eli behave so badly, and Eli doesn't do anything about it, in chapter 3, next chapter, it says that he knew about it. In verse 13, that his sons were blaspheming God right there in the sanctuary, doing these terrible things. And so therefore it says in verse 27 of chapter 2 that a man of God came. And it doesn't really say who it was, but this mysterious prophet comes and kind of gives a speech which is kind of a curse against Eli and his sons and his family, that his family was not going to be able to be the priests anymore. And that's found in verses 31 through 36. It's this oracle of doom against Eli and his family. And sure enough, at the time of Solomon, the end comes for Eli's great-great-grandson, the priest Abiathar. So this idea that a priest is replaced, and it's kind of an allegory, as St. Augustine says, of the fact that eventually the old priesthood is going to be replaced by a good, true priesthood, which is the priesthood of Jesus Christ. And that's kind of prophesied, you might say, in verse number 35, where it says, the Lord speaks, I will raise up for myself a faithful priest. And actually there was a diarchic messianism at the time of Jesus. The Essenes believed that there was going to be two messiahs, a priestly messiah and a kingly messiah. But of course they didn't know that it was going to be one person. Jesus Christ is both the king and the priest who is going to come, the perfect fulfillment of all the prophecies of the Old Testament.